Essa Suleiman, who was arrested on Wednesday in Golders Green, appeared in court this morning to be charged with the attempted murder of 3 men. The court was told Suleiman had known the first victim, Ismail Hussein, who he allegedly stabbed in South London, for 20 years. The suspect's accused of then taking a train across the city to the heart of the capital's Jewish community in North London, where police say he stabbed 2 others, 76-year-old Norman Shine, who remains in hospital, and Shlomi Rand, who's been discharged. Both men Orthodox Jews and clearly wearing religious clothing. Suleiman wore a grey tracksuit in the dock this morning and spoke only to confirm his name and address. His case will next be heard by the Old Bailey in a fortnight. Channel 4 News had previously revealed that Suleiman had only just been released from a mental health unit at the Maudsley. The wider context, separate but connected, Britain's Jewish community processing this latest attack. The national terror threat level increased, driven by a rise in both Islamist and extreme right-wing terrorism. Ahead of the Jewish Day of Rest, the people of Golders Green collect bread for their evening Shabbat meal. Where does Britain go next? In particular, what to do about pro-Palestine marches, which the chief rabbi, among others, says is contributing to anti-Semitism.
When you incite hatred against somebody else or incite violence towards another race or another religion, I think freedom of speech actually stops there, because we all know what happens when it doesn't get stopped.
I don't think that's the issue. I think that it comes down to education on raising awareness amongst all these different communities, that the narrative, and not just the Muslim communities, I'd say in general.
The Prime Minister says the government will clamp down on anti-Semitism, particularly in relation to chants and banners. Under pressure from Jewish groups, police have already warned they'll arrest people who shout, "Globalise the Intifada," for example. The Justice Minister promising police more resources.
I would expect the police, given their operational independence, to arrest anyone who is acting illegally and is acting dangerously on these marches. But we need to get that balance right between that right to freedom to protest, the right of free speech.
Attention now turns to May the 16th, when 2 big marches with very different worldviews are planned for central London. One pro-Palestinian, the other organised by far-right activist Stephen Yaxley-Lennon.
Over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at what this current context means for those events and whether we need to be even more assertive with use of our powers.
Like enforcing the ban on the words, "Globalise the Intifada."
Well, it just seems to me it's completely unworkable. The French government tried this recently to ban, not that slogan, but the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And actually, they were defeated in doing so.
But it doesn't solve the problem of it feeling like a threat to many people in the Jewish community.
But that is something which just simply isn't true by the slogan. I mean, Intifada means, I'm not an Arabic speaker, but it means struggle, uprising, that kind of thing. Now, if it was said in English, nobody would bat an eyelid at globalise the uprising.
Many of Britain's Jews feel like they've been forced onto the front lines of an existential culture war they never signed up for. Freedom of speech versus safety.
Well, earlier I spoke to the lawyer, Adam Wagner, and the former US State Department advisor, Jasmine El-Gamal, who now lives in the UK. And I started by asking why this debate seems to have come down to the marches or what is being said at those marches.
The marches have been an ever-present feature of life, where people have go into town and they'll be walking down a street and suddenly hear thousands of people coming around a corner shouting for Intifada, and that is all Zionist out or whatever it would be. And obviously a lot of what happens on those marches is totally unobjectionable, peaceful, important political statements, but to have that kind of rhetoric on the streets for Jewish people who know very much what Intifada means, it goes back to violent uprisings involving suicide attacks and the like. It's not a surprise that people link the fact that there's lots of people walking down the streets on a regular basis calling for violence, and then violence happens.
Right, but do you want legislation to ban marches? Because to have a sort of a blanket ban rather than a march-by-march ban would require new law, wouldn't it?
It would, yes, you definitely couldn't have a standing ban on marches under the existing legislation. You can, under Section 13 of the Public Order Act, ban marches if there's a risk of serious disorder. You cannot ban assemblies, so you can't ban static protests. But I personally would not want. I don't think it's necessary to have a new legislation to have a standing ban on marches. I think probably that would be going too far. I think the right approach is to consider the threat level and the individual facts of a protest before it happens and decide what to do then.
Jasmine, Adam just said, Jews know what intifada means, but it is contested, isn't it? I mean, what does it mean to you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And I think this is a really important debate to be having, because I think there's a difference between what a term actually means, what meanings are assigned to the term by other people, and then whether or not to ban the term itself, right? Those are three slightly different conversations. As an Arabic speaker, I can tell you that the term intifada means literally a shaking off of oppression or of an oppressive structure. And so that's what it means literally. Now, how it's being used in the marches, I think vast majority of people are using it, from people I've spoken to who have used it, are saying we are fighting against oppression, we are fighting against oppressive structures, we're fighting against occupation or standing against occupation. I absolutely empathize with Jewish people who hear that word and feel afraid. And I think it's important to recognize that, right? Fear is not always rational, but when someone feels fear, it's always valid. And I so think it's important to recognize the fear that people feel when they hear that term and talk about it. When I talk to people who use that term, my debates with them are, listen, I think you have the right to use that term. I don't think it should be illegal. There's nothing about it that talks about Jewish people. But given how it makes people feel, do you think maybe there's another way to say what you want to say? And I don't see that conversation happening so often. I think just assuming that someone who uses that phrase is calling for death to Jews or so on is not right. It's not the case.
Because the police have already said after the Heaton Park attack that they would take action if people were seen using "globalize the Intifada," and that they would regard that as at least potentially breaking the law. Do you think that's wrong?
I do. And I'll tell you why I think it's wrong, because I think it's such a slippery slope when you start criminalizing speech. Where do you draw the line? Whose fears are prioritized over, which communities' fears are prioritized? By going after specific terms, you risk, as a government, alienating other parts, other communities within British societies by seemingly prioritizing one.
Adam, is there any danger of confusing correlation with causation when it comes to the language on the marches as well? Have you seen any evidence that actually links the speech on the marches with actual violence?
I mean, I don't think you'll ever find that sort of direct evidence, because unless you find an attacker who's been on the marches, but even then, maybe not. But what we're seeing in the past year, to make no bones about it, it's political violence against Jewish targets through the Heaton Park attack, through the arson attacks on synagogues. Each and every time, the people who claim responsibility have said this is about what's going on in the Middle East. Each and every time. Including the terrorist attack. I don't know about Wednesday. We don't know about his motivations yet. But apart from that, it's all political violence.
That may
and
be
therefore,
true. The question of whether the language is inciting it. Whether somebody saying globalize the Intifada on a march is actually inciting that political violence, or whether the two things are separate.
In a way, it doesn't matter, because incitement to violence is a criminal offence, and it's seen as a social ill, regardless of what it leads to. and also calling for supporting terrorism. There's been lots of arrests at these marches, a minimum, a small amount of people relative to the large group, but there have been arrests throughout for incitement to terrorism. It doesn't need there to be incitement to an actual act for it to be a criminal offence.
Adam Wagner, Jasmine El Gamal, thank you very much indeed.